So after these really impressive pictures by Inkenballer, we need to add something to talk about Aleppo. And since I'm an architect and I'm used to plan but also to build, and in former times my office even had the chance to build a little bit in cooperation with architects from Aleppo. Downtown, the old city of Aleppo, for instance, this beautiful public spaces in front of the staircase to the Citadel. It's very sad that we need to talk about Aleppo in this way, but as a planner at the same time, we have to look forward. We need to ask what can we do about this problem and what can we do to prepare, to be prepared for the time when the guns stop shooting and we have to come back to the people. The first step, definitely, but as an architect, also come back to the city as a build structure. But I don't like to talk about the build structure today. That was done by Inkenballer. Today I would raise a very simple question. What is the value to talk about Aleppo? We have seen it very much by these pictures last half an hour ago. But I would like to stress a little bit the point to say, think about the intangible values that we were able to get to know when we have been working in and with Aleppo for a few years. I have been there the first time in 2006. You've been there in 6? 2006, yeah. 6? To Christoph. Yeah, 2006. Yeah, and then the last time you have been there in 2010. So 4 years of engagement, learning, and a little bit living in Aleppo. And my point today is that we have witnessed a very, very interesting and tough group working downtown to rehabilitate the historic city. And I guess this is what I quote today is that these planning strategies that have been taken were very successful as far as we have seen it at the very end. And this is a sort of, let's say, maybe it's a planning culture or at least a notion, a habit towards the old city that we maybe recall at this city to a given time in the future. Or at least we can learn and to ask whether it could help to reconstruct the city. We do know a lot about reconstruction in this country. We have very, very clear, let's say, disciplines following a more, let's say, conservative way of how to reconstruct cities after the war, and a very modern way to do it. The more, let's say, conservatives were like Freiburg or Münster or Munich. We know everything about it, how they did it, and what kind of strategies they were following. And we know all the so-called modernistic approaches right after the war, such as Stuttgart, my hometown, Hanover, Kassel, and all of them. And we know very clearly what was, from our side, from our point of view from today, what was done wrong. And we do have I think, a lot of experience, again, right after the reunification, when many of the old towns of the former GDR were almost collapsed. And from my side, this was one of the reasons why we had this peaceful, let's say, revolution, because people simply realized that this kind of state would not survive, because they could see that their historic cities were collapsing. So we had to deal with them, and right in this city of Cottbus, this was one of the model cities, one of 20 cities, which were, let's say, organized in a very specific way how to rehabilitate the city to a point as you see it today. Just to mention one figure, about 75 million euro public money was put into this Sanierungsportfolio, that's frame, and in total a turnover of about 4 or 5 times this money by private investment. So into this city was put about 500 million euros just within the guideline of the rehabilitation. This is why it looks like it looks. So in this country, we do have a lot of experience how to reconstruct or to follow this kind of discussions. And we have seen that the cooperation and the colleagues who were working in Aleppo, it was more or less GGZ or the Aga Khan, I mentioned them later again, but they found already, so to speak, a culture of a little bit of resistance. I can't explain it deeper how it happens, but in a time when, let's say, under the French mandate, many of the Syrian cities were planned by colleagues like Couteau or others. The following plans of the city were, let's say, not obeyed by the city. And this is very interesting. But to start with the very first slide here is actually the city is more than, before the war, 2.5 million inhabitants, and the city is rather rapidly growing, more than 50,000 a year. This is quite a sum and needs a lot of, let's say, enterprises for providing the city with living and living areas. But the city, when we come to downtown, actually was growing, as you can see it, in newer elements, very much to the west and to the northwest. And the city had about 200,000 inhabitants in 1920. I don't know, Inken, did you show this slide? Yeah. And now it rose up to 2.5 million. And at the same time, the inhabitants of downtown was collapsing from formerly 200,000 to less than 100,000. Just in comparison, Cottbus shrunk from the time of union from 100,000 to now 130,000 to now 100,000. So lost 30,000 inhabitants. It's almost a third. At the same time, the historical city gained from 8,000 to 10,000, plus 25%. And this is, so to speak, more or less the opposite result that you can find here in Aleppo, and this was one of the problem reasons. Then what the colleagues found there is the Danger plan from the 30s, or the Gouton plan from the 50s that was followed in the 70s, but the city simply refused, after certain, let's say, small streets, very little, let's say, impact on the historical ground, the city refused to follow that any further. And this is very, very interesting. I can't explain actually why. It's maybe because of this Aleppinian habit. It's different, for instance, to Damascus. Here you can see very nicely the old city of Damascus with a mosque in the center. At the northern edge, the so-called Souk al-Hajj, or Al-Hal, there was still in 2000 a competition going on to enlarge the traffic system downtown. And we were arguing even with our colleagues from the University of Damascus not to follow up such a strategy. And still, or walk over there, and they still discuss it, and I guess as soon as they have the means, the political means or the financial means, they will do so. So Aleppo is in so far something very special that they have used to, and to withstand this kind of let's say, converting the city with this traffic system. So the historical downtown, hast du die Zahlen gezeigt gehabt? Ein bisschen schon. But maybe what is, let's say, what is all about downtown, the old city of Aleppo? We find more than 300 kilometers of streets and alleys, more than 250 listed monuments, more than 12 hectares. 1 hectare, German hectare, is 100 meter by 100 meters, so it's quite a bit. Of 12 hectares of covered souk. We do have all service of downtown, old city is 360 acres, about more than 100,000 inhabitants, but 16,000 plots, that means 16,000 ownerships, 16,000 houses. So in comparison, 250 monuments. So you can see that we actually talk about urban landscape, because the overwhelming amount of lots and houses is, so to speak, the ordinary houses, not your monuments. The ordinary, what we actually see as a constitutes the structure of the city. And the monuments, They highlight the structure. They give identity. But we know we need them both. In the relation, you can see the ratio, let's say 16,000 to 250, so you can see that we mostly talk about urban landscapes and historic urban landscapes. And we have, at the very end, right before the Civil War, about 30,000 jobs. And this is a plan I really admire. It's, I guess, by Wirth and by Heinz done. You have shown it as well. This is such, because we love plans. But at that point, I could at least point out that this shows very nicely these 12 hectares of covered souk. This is this beautiful souk structure and gives you very much the idea of the Hellenistic structure and all this Mamluk structure and everything deriving from the western gate to the Citadel, lining up, let's say, that was being covered later on as this famous souk in Aleppo. So what is also, I think it's intangible and talks about the strategy and makes it unique is that the partners of cooperation, how to deal with this urban landscape, this is rather exceptional on a local side, but also on the international side. Just to quote, Shidi said, Arab Fund, Aga Khan, and also the Friends of Aleppo, where I'm a member of. This is a small club, we call it in Germany Verein, supporting club for the old town of Aleppo, situated in Stuttgart. And this is one of the, I think, of the most astonishing thing that we can face in Aleppo, and to be honest, in such, at least theoretical statements, I have never seen it before in any other, in this amount, in any other cities in the Middle East, that we actually are very likely, let's say, at the top, at the height of, let's say, blending ideas that we also follow in our area. This is state of the art. On the one hand, quote that blending needs a sort of top-down, following, let's say, the systematic knowledge of experts, but also following the sectoral knowledge and wisdom of the people who live there and who are experts how to live on a site and to make one's living in all of it, know everything and all the problems. And to bring this together, this is rather unique. And today I will give you some hints of how, let's say, this blending understanding, this blending philosophy, as far as I think, is unique, it's outstanding, it's intangible, and of a very high value we could count off in the future. So one of the first steps they were doing, say, by investigating the area, making analysis, is how we could understand the city, how it is used today. It's more or less, let's say, the development plan, but it's also a plan who doing the analysis, where the people live, where we do have mixed structures, where the administration is going on, where are the most important sites for tourism, where we have mixed residential, where we do have open spaces. And this led to a strategic zoning, and this is rather interesting to see in the very center, where I have marked with a white X. You can see the round structure, the figure by the Citadel. This is to be so, a very special area. This is for tourism, this is for administration, bazaar, and so on. But right behind the Citadel, D4, you see, you have a declining residential area, and even further to the north, to the south, and to the east, you see the F zone. This is rather slum-like, and you have already seen some slides by Inkenballer who is showing this. But on the other hand, we have more or less to the west, we have the A zones, mixed use, which are under pressure. That means development is going on, pressure on the public realm, pressure on the plots, pressure on the ownership, on all of this. We have some zones being consolidated, like Citadel, the area where formerly the Christian and Jewish lived. And we have areas like in the B, where we have moderate changes where the pressure is not so high. So this gets into, let's say, investigating this area beyond, let's say, these aerial uses, but more on understanding the notion and the driving forces that you can use for the development of the city. And from that on, they reacted and said, we make, let's say, pilot action areas, which, let's say, to face these problems, which have been investigated before, just to quote one, provide positive examples to initiate awareness of the neighborhood or empower the local community by measures in a public space, what is rather unique because actually in this kind of cities in the Middle East, public realm is rather left to somebody else and not to its, let's say, to put it to one's own duties. To let's say to start awarenesses that everybody is a little bit let's say responsible for the public spaces, and the public spaces is also where, let's say, the private investigations should be placed to come to a turnover and to have an impact on private, let's say, investment policies. And this is just a few examples getting into these areas which are being, let's say, targeted, such as social and cultural intervention, create awareness in neighborhood. We had already restoration and consolidation processes cost private investment, or reserve structural and functional changes caused by economic pressures. That means really strategies on this, or what I mentioned last, the rehabilitation of 1 square cost private initiatives for upgrading of the surrounding areas. So this is rather interesting, coming from the functions of the city to the problems of the city to real action areas and strategies how to work with this kind of problems. The next big element is we have heard 16,000 plots is quite a bit. It's quite an amount. But at least at the very end, as far as we could witness it, more than 900 houses have been secured and renovated. This is quite a bit, and because the starting point was rather crucial, because more of 30% of the houses are under very poor structural conditions. 80% of the households earn a minimum income, can't really afford regular maintenance. This is because downgrading of the inner city, and the ones who could afford have left, and the poor people coming from the countryside use this to take over these, let's say, cheap and inexpensive houses and flats. And this is a strategy you could also obey in Cottbus, when we already have, let's say, fixed and prepared all our prefabricated slabs at the edge of the city, while downtown the investment in housing by the companies, by the private companies, are rather poor right now. Already you can obey that the ones are getting into downtown. And this is a very difficult strategy. Yeah? Okay, more than 30% of the population left between the 70s and the early 90s. And what is also a problem, when you have a house, a unit, a typology, and you start just to take care about the maintenance, and you start dividing it. So you have a very complicated ownership. And this is still one of the problems we are facing in Cottbus. We do have some leftover unclear situations downtown, because ownership of the house and ownership of the ground is not cleared yet. Until today, until 25 years after reunification, we still face this problem. So it is not a minor problem. Okay, just to allocate these houses, and it was mentioned that the turnover is already 5 times, and the total amount, we couldn't tell what does it mean, 25 million Syrian pounds right now, but at that time it was quite an amount. But also what was done is to ask and to help the people who live there, even they are poor, and even they are coming from the countryside, to make not only living affordable, but make living at that point worthwhile, of a value. That means some of the social services had to be, let's say, added. And one of the most important things for young families to stay there, and for women to stay there, to have, let's say, doctors, and have social amendments, but also, let's say, schools. Something like schools is just one of the examples that children here are claiming we are living in the old city and we have our cities in the old school. This is astonishing. And what is also astonishing, that one of these 240 monuments, like the Shibami School, is a beautiful school. It's also a house of culture where you could find the permanent exhibition of what the GTZ and the Aga Khan was doing for many years, from the 70s, from the early 90s up to 2010 or 11, but also restoration and schools and all kind of cultural affairs within this house. And what was also done was training on restoration, woodwork restoration, but also how to restore monuments. That means not only to do it, but also to use it as, let's say, as a teaching tool to bring up again craftsmanship. Not only to do and to restore the monuments, but at the same time to use it as a learning element and to re-establish craftsmanship. Who is able to work this beautiful gray limestone, Chalab, die Graue, die graue Stadt. One of the strongest rules you find there is you can build with any kind of material unless it's our limestone. And this is a very, very strong thing next to the, let's say, so to speak, the urban guidelines. The building line forming the space and the material. This is one of, I'm very sure, of the strongest elements and rules one should obey next to this intangible knowledge. We should obey and give any kind of reconstruction, let's say, teams as advice. We learned this from our cities. We have the chance to advise. But what they also did, and not only talked about, they put into downtown technical infrastructure, and some pictures will prove this. There's almost 95% of the sewage network was replaced, and this is just one of the networks up to 2007 that has been, let's say, reached. This is an incredible amount, an incredible strength and power, how they achieved to do that. And also they were trying to, what does it mean mobility? What does it mean traffic downtown to avoid through traffic, to improve public transport and all of this. And they not only started to do plans, but they also made strategies and even invented or bought small, I don't have the cars here right now. Actually, here you can see a little bit one of these cars, which they use as wide as one camel plus its baggage, not further than this, able to drive through the small alley roads. But also what is astonishing, I mentioned already, is that they had a notion and the idea that one had to improve and to invest into, let's say, environmental conditions. That's not less than our public space and our public realm, and how to put it in and how to find supporters. And this is one of the plans we did in our office in Stuttgart. In the center you see the Citadel, the green down there is the area that we could build in fact, but also some investigations being interesting what is, let's say, this cultural Kulturschutz of English isn't Kulturschutz, cultural garbage or so, cultural garbage on top of this Citadel, but being unveiled you find all these treasures of the former time. So this is a real understanding, a very far-going understanding of being aware and being, let's say, conscious about its own history. That's the wrong way direction. But what was also done, it's in terms of being aware of the environment, taking care of the public spaces. As we can see, the Prinzesgarten in Berlin, let's say, greening campaign, as we call it, urban gardening or stuff like this. I'm not so close into this, or not so the favorite, but sometimes it helps to cover or to bridge a certain time using brownfields in a good way. But to have it in that, okay, I have to hurry a bit. But in such a city, as a part of the, let's say, investment into public spaces, dealing in such a high-end, it's a high-end discussion, even in our society, to find it in Aleppo, I think it's outstanding. Here are some pictures, and even, let's say, dividing the city up to get rid of this solid waste and trying to create a collection system, or even things like that, air pollution and noise measurement. This is high end. Yeah? And even coming up in a city, in a state like Syria, coming up with participation and community development. I remember being in Aleppo with Siad Muhanna, being downtown Goethe Institute, and we were talking about, he was asked, what are you doing actually here? And some of the students mentioned, we bring you a little bit of democracy. Just like, I mean, it's as students discuss, but also interpret, let's say, the topics of the DAD, yeah? The strategic partners. What does it mean, strategic partners? Under this flag, we were, let's say, sailing for almost 10 years, yeah? And what kind of ride was going on at that point? Yeah? And now being in a city, yeah? Discussing participation, bottom-up strategies. And as far as I could feel and realize, I found that the cities and the citizens lived these options, and they were proud about it. And they always, as I felt being different because of all of this, being different. And you just can continue these ideas of participation in tourism affairs, or, okay, this is more or less easy, one of these bites being turned for tourism into local economy, but also, let's say, all the program of culture in the old city is outstanding. For the ones who are nosy about all of this, this is more or less, not in the way I did it, but different, published and readable as a toolkit, all these kinds of planning elements, all these kinds of tools which has been, let's say, tested in Aleppo. You can at least find in English and Arabic version by the GDZ, and I would like to repeat and come to an end is, I think this kind of strategy, this knowledge about planning, this idea of how to work downtown, to summarize all of these different tools, coming from top down, bottom up, and with the people, this is a knowledge I bet, I'm very sure, we can count on as one of the tools, and I think this will, next to other strategies, I really simply mentioned because we are really trained in this kind of problems within our history, but this, as so to speak, to work in existing given circumstances, in environment. This sort of, so to speak, intangible knowledge is for me a very important given quality and identity that we have to obey and we can count on. Thank you very much for listening.